This is Patty Sue Spires with Road Trip Radio. We are taking a trip back in time today, remembering one of history's most profound miracles during World War I, the Christmas Truce. We start our look back on a most remarkable Christmas with some music by country star singer Garth Brooks, a tune about a brief moment of peace on earth in the middle of the First World War.
Oh, the snowflakes fell in silence over Bellawood that night, for a Christmas truce had been declared by both sides of the fight. And as we lay there in our trenches, the silence broke in two by a German soldier singing a song that we all knew. Though I did not know the language, the song was Silent Night. Then I heard my buddy whisper, all is calm and all is bright. Then the fear and doubt surrounded me, 'cause I'd die if I was wrong. But I stood up in my trench and I began to see along. Then across the frozen battlefield another's voice joined in, until one by one each man became a singer of the hymn. Then I thought that I was dreaming, for right there in my sight stood the German soldier beneath the falling flakes of white. And he raised his hand and smiled at me, as if he seemed to say, here's hoping we both live to see us find a better way. Then the devil's clock struck midnight and the skies lit up again, and the battlefield where heaven stood was blown to hell again. But for just one fleeting moment, the answer seemed so clear. Heaven's not beyond the clouds, it's just beyond the fear. No, heaven's not beyond the clouds, it's for us to find it here.
A moving song and a most remarkable story. It sounds almost too good to be true, doesn't it? Well, there is certainly a good deal of creative license in the lyrics. In fact, while the Americans did fight the Germans in the Belleau Woods during World War I, it was not at Christmas, but rather in the summer, and there was no such truce at that time. Much of the song is based on an earlier incident, a truce that really did happen. The Great War, as it was called before we had to number our world wars, started in August of 1914. Despite earlier gains by the Germans, by Christmas it had bogged down into trench warfare. A line of trenches more than 300 miles long stretched from the English Channel to neutral Switzerland. On one side were the Germans. On the other were the French, Belgians, English, and Scots. Historian Stanley Weintraub has written a book about the Christmas truce. It is called Silent Night. He describes the trenches and the losses that took place in them.
The German artist Otto Dix, who was a famous expressionist artist and who survived the war, he described the fortified ditches as, quote, lice, rats, barbed wire, fleas, shells, bombs, underground caves, corpses, blood, liquor, mice, cats, artillery, filth, bullets, mortars, fire, steel. That's what war is, he said. It's the work of the devil. It was pretty much like that. And the conditions were miserable, standing up in ditches, your feet in the water, the temperature just about at freezing. If you stick your head up above the trench, you get it shot off. No Man's Land was a very short patch of land, only 65 or 70 yards, separated the troops. The British had already lost 90,000 men by Christmas. The generals behind the lines in World War I, they did nothing to try to keep the casualties down. As far as they were concerned, this was a war of attrition. If you can bleed the enemy until the enemy is too weak to resist, well then you win the war. The French losses in the first 4 months of the war were 854,000. The German losses were 747,000. This is just up until Christmas. The British sent Christmas boxes, and inside were chocolates or cigarettes. The Germans sent wooden boxes, and they contained sometimes sausages, cigarettes, cigars, chocolates. And the Germans even sent in little Christmas trees. The Christmas trees were in the German tradition of being tabletop size, 30 inches to 36 inches high. They could stick them in the mud on the parapets of their trenches. But the efficient Germans went beyond that. They equipped them with candles that were attached by clamps. All the soldiers had to do was light them and celebrate Christmas. But if you lit a match in No Man's Land, you'd be shot at. And so how could they defuse the intentions of the enemy to shoot their trees down? They began singing Christmas carols.
During the Second World War, Anne Barbier was a little girl. Her father, Arthur Oakeshott, had served in the First World War as a private in the Queen's Regiment and had participated in the Truce. At Christmas time during the Second World War, he gathered his children around the fireplace and for the first time told them about it. Anne remembers her father's story.
When the Second World War started and he was home on leave and talked about the First World War and said he hoped that it wouldn't be as bloody as the first one, literally. And we girls would sit and listen to his tales. He was 16 in the First World War. They were very jingoistic. You know, we don't want to fight, but by jingo, if we do, we've got the men, we've got the ships, and we've got the money too. And they were joining up at the age of 16 and 17. They expected so much slaughter that they were taking as many young men as they could. And they put their ages up, of course. He was home for Christmas that first year of the war, 1939. And he said that there was going to be so much killing that they felt that it would be a good idea if we celebrated by singing Silent Night, Holy Night. It was my mother who said that. And then my father said, oh, well, the First World War, I was there. And we asked what had happened. The guns slowly stopped. There had been a bombardment. They went all the time. And it was extraordinary, he told us, that the bombardment didn't cease all at once. It just slowed down. And it became very quiet. And you must remember that the trenches were sometimes only a few hundred yards apart. There would be the Germans on one side of No Man's Land, as they called it, where there was just devastation, and then the British troops, and they were in trenches with the hunkered down in the mud. And my father said that they heard singing.
Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, alles schläft, einsam wach.
The men all looked at each other and they thought it was a German ploy to get us out, you know, and shoot us. And the singing became even louder. Some of the officers came out and said, what's going on there? One of the officers stood up and there were several German soldiers who had a white flag. They were unarmed and they came towards the trenches where my father and the other men were, and gradually they put their heads with their helmets on over the top, as they called it. and they saw these Germans coming, and in the background was singing Silent Night, Holy Night.
Kundgemacht, nur das Rauch der hochheilige Pracht.
And the officer said, I better go and investigate what it is. And he took off. They wore belts with Mills bombs, they were called, that they could, hand grenades, they call them nowadays, they're called Mills bombs then. And he took off his weaponry, and he put his gun down, and climbed up over the top, and went towards them. And then an officer appeared, and with his hand out to shake hands with the officer who was in charge of this particular platoon. Gradually, the men all rose in the dark. He said that there was a mist, and these figures were coming towards them. It was extraordinary. And the English soldiers recognized the Silent Night, Holy Night, and started singing it in English.
Alles kann, alles breit, nur das Virgin, Mother and Child. Oh, the infant so tender and mild.
And the Germans were coming, and they were clasping each other, putting their arms round each other's shoulders. They were out there for about 25 minutes, and gradually they separated and moved back into the mist and went back into their own trenches. They were all quite overcome. Many of the men were crying, were weeping. I don't think they knew. This was 1914. It was the beginning of the war, and they didn't know the long, dragging months of slaughter that would go on. All he remembers is weeping. Well, he was only a boy, weeping at what he hoped was an armistice. And it wasn't. It was just the first sign that the troops were not all that happy about going into war. Oh, it started up the following day. The officers thought it was a ploy, and the Germans also. And the day after Christmas is called Boxing Day, and the guns started. You know, this is a war, folks. We know. Come on, young men, you know. We've declared war, and we've got to fight it. Jingoism again. We were at war. You couldn't do that. So it wasn't done, you know, to be friendly with the Germans. We were going to kill them.
Historian Stanley Weintraub.
You have to imagine this as something that was going on simultaneously up and down the front. Light snow with frost came on Christmas Eve, and the result was that this concealed the smell of death, the smell of the bodies that had littered no man's land. The troops bumped into them in the darkness as they crawled toward each other, but they didn't stink. And the next day they could conceal them by burying them. Burial had to be quick and crude. They buried the dead in no man's land, and they did so separating the bodies of the Germans and the other side. The commonality of culture made it easy to have impromptu services because everybody knew the 23rd Psalm. They had to bury them where they could. But the troops who played soccer could not have done so unless the dead were out of sight. The bridge of commonality was in part based on occupation. In the case of World War I, barbers and farmers and butchers and taxi drivers and waiters in restaurants and so on. And they knew each other. They knew each other's nature of work, and they understood each other's style of living. A British soldier meets his German barber in no man's land, meets him by accident. The German barber had worked in England and then as a reservist was called back to Germany before he could be stopped. And they met in no man's land, and the German barber looked at his former client and said, you need a back and sides trim. Sat him down on a ammunition box in no man's land between the trenches, and in the quiet and the celebratory nature of that event, he got out his razor and scissors and trimmed his client's hair.
During the truce, the troops exchanged handshakes, hugs, and gifts like cigarettes, cigars, and even alcohol. Some took photos. Most tried to get a souvenir from the enemy.
The most valued souvenir from the Germans was their buckle, the belt buckle, which said Gott mit uns, God with us. It was true in World War II also. Everybody wanted a German-built buckle. You could carry that home. Some of the British prized the German Pickelhaube helmet with a spike on top. But how do you get that home? How do you carry that around with you? So that was a very rare one. The troops themselves were so taken by what they were experiencing. They looked on it, one of them said, like a waking dream. And they wrote home about it.
Lieutenant Johannes Niemann was a German Saxon. He wrote home to describe a soccer game with the Scots.
Later, a Scottish soldier appeared, made a football, which seemed to come from nowhere, and a few minutes later, a real football match got underway. It was far from easy to play on the frozen ground, but we continued, keeping rigorously to the rules, despite the fact that it only lasted an hour and that we had no referee. A great many of the passes went wide, but all the amateur football players, although they must have been very tired, played with huge enthusiasm. Us Shermans really roared when a gust of wind revealed that the Scots were no underdrawers under their kilts. But after an hour's play, when our commanding officer heard about it, he sent an order that we must put a stop to it. A little later, we drifted back to our trenches. The game finished with a score of 3-2 in favor of Fritz against Tommy.
In some areas, Anglo-Saxons were across the lines from German Saxons.
This was not uniform along the front lines. Troops were fraternizing in no man's land, even playing football in no man's land, usually with improvised soccer balls, while the battalion next to them on either flank might be fighting. It was a surreal situation in that respect. I think it was important that there was that commonality, Anglo-Saxon and Saxon. But the Saxons were only a small part of the Germans who fought on the other side. The Saxons, though, were among the most friendly. And the Saxon soldiers would say, you're going to have to be careful because we're going to be replaced by Prussians. They knew that they were different, and Prussians were much more belligerent.
A German corporal named Adolf Hitler refused to take part in the truce, saying he didn't believe in Christmas and he didn't believe in fraternizing with the enemy. Commanders on both sides of the line were not pleased with the spontaneous truce. But how do you make soldiers who have prayed, sung, and played soccer with each other go back to shooting at the man they just shared Christmas with?
They go back to making war by replacing those people as much as they can. If you have to demonize your enemy to shoot at your enemy, then you need to put people in place who are going to see the enemy as demons. And so you take out the people who have been on the line. You do so anyway because the troops are always rotated. It's hellish and exhausting to keep them there too long. And so you rotate the troops who knew each other out, bring them back to the rear areas, give them food and a bath, clean clothes again, and clean up the lice that they're infested with, and then bring in troops who didn't know the enemy, and they will fire on command.
Weintraub says there are lessons to be learned from the Christmas truce.
Peace is harder to make than war. I think that's the lesson we learn, that peace is harder to make than war. Once we get it started, how do you turn it off? And we have to learn the enormity of that fact. Perhaps the other message we get out of it, one that people feel uplifting rather than depressing, is a line that comes from a song that was popular perhaps 10 years ago and is still played a great deal, called Christmas in the Trenches. The idea that once we discover that the soldiers on both ends of the rifle are the same, it's pretty hard to fight a war.
Oh, my name is Francis Tolliver. I come from Liverpool. 2 years ago the war was waiting for me after school. From Belgium on to Flanders, Germany to here, I fought for king and country I loved dear. 'Twas Christmas in the trenches, and the frost so bitter hung.
The frozen fields of France were still, no songs of peace were sung. Our families back in England were toasting us that day. They're brave and glorious lads, so far away. I was lying with me messmates on the cold and rocky ground, when across the lines of battle came a most peculiar sound. Says I, now listen up, me boys, each soldier strained to hear, as one young German voice sang out so clear. He's singing bloody well, you know, my partner says to me. Soon one by one each German voice joined in harmony. The cannons rested silent and the gas cloud rolled no more, as Christmas brought us respite from the war. As soon as they were finished and a reverend pause was spent, God rest ye merry gentlemen, struck up some lads from Kent. Oh, the next they sang was Stille Nacht, to Silent Night, says I, and in two tongues one song filled up that sky. There's someone coming towards us now, the frontline sentry cried. All sights were fixed on one lone figure, trudging from their side. His truce flag like a Christmas star shone on the plain so bright, as he bravely trudged unarmed into the night. Then one by one on either side walked into no man's land. Neither gun nor bayonet, we met there hand to hand. We shared some secret brandy and we wished each other well. And in a flare-lit football game, we gave them hell. We traded chocolates and cigarettes and photographs from home. These sons and fathers far away from families of their own. Tom Sanders played his squeeze box and they had a violin. This curious and unlikely band of men. Soon daylight stole upon us, and France was France once more. With sad farewells we each began to settle back to war. But the question haunted every heart that lived that wondrous night: whose family have I fixed within my sight? 'Twas Christmas in the trenches, and the frost so bitter hung. The frozen fields of France were warm as songs of peace were sung. For the walls they'd kept between us to exact the work of war had been crumbled and were gone forevermore. My name is Francis Tolliver, in Liverpool I dwell. Each Christmas come since World War I, I've learned its lessons well. For the ones who call the shots won't be among the dead and lame. and on each end of the rifle we're the same.
The importance of the song is that the soldiers have learned in the Christmas truce that both ends of the rifle were the same, and that's perhaps the most uplifting part of the story, because troops who have some kind of commonality of culture can't remain enemies very long. And the commonality of culture in the event described in the Christmas Truce of 1914 was represented by Christmas. They thought of it in terms of peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Even the songs they sang, the Christmas songs, were the same except for translations into other languages. They knew the melodies, they knew the songs. They found a harmony in singing the same song. They had a harmony in exchanging presents. They even cut buttons off their uniforms and exchanged them. How can you fight an enemy that is no longer demonized? If the person becomes like you, if on each end of the rifle they're the same, how do you go back to war?
The song was written by John McCutcheon and performed by Canadian singer John McDermott. He has actually performed the song for World War I veterans who were there for the truce. The song is very special to them and to him as well.
You know, I think what McCutcheon's done at the end of this piece is quite valid in that the explanation is that over the course of the evening, we're listening to a story unfold where people who speak a different language share intimately everything that they do in life. It's just the same on that side as it is on this side, and it qualifies as something that is a very, very important part of their lives. All these things, and at the very end of the piece, the comment that comes across is, you know, the ones who call the shots won't be among the dead and lame, but on each end of the rifle, we're the same.
Weintraub agrees.
Once you start it, it's pretty hard to stop. Peace is harder to make than war. And I think if governments kept that more in mind and not the idea that there was something to gain from exploiting patriotism or exploiting national dignity, we'd be a lot better off. War is cruel. As Otto Dix said, it's the work of the devil.
We end with more music, a song the 2nd Scots Guards sang as they stood in no man's land, sharing a drink with their German enemies that Christmas so long ago.
Forward, lang syne, my dear. Forward, lang syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for days of old lang syne.
We'd like to send our Christmas thanks to historian Stanley Weintraub, the author of Silent Night. His book is available in local bookstores and on the internet. The song Christmas in the Trenches was performed by John McDermott and is available online from his website and at music stores. Silent Night was performed by Robert Sinnert and Dan Newton.
On the road again, just can't wait to get on the road again. The life I love is making music with my friends, and I can't wait to get on the road again.
This is Patty Sue Spires with Road Trip Radio. Listen next week at 8 a.m. and weeknights at 9:30 p.m. and see you on the road.
Never see again. I can't wait to get on the road again. On the road again. Like a band of gypsies, we go down the highway. We're the best of friends, insisting that the world keep turning our way. And our way is on the road again. I just can't wait to get on the road again. The life I love is making music with my friends, and I can't wait to get on on the road again.